Part 43. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 421. The yellow-haired man held a pistol, with the muzzle pointed at Chen Tao. He put one hand in his trouser pocket, tilted his head, stared at Chen Tao, and said with a playful smile, "How about it? Will you let me join the game now?" Chen Tao looked at the muzzle of the gun in front of him, and he slowly let go of Fang Shueking's slender waist. He looked at the muzzle in front of him. After more than half a year, he was pointed at by someone again. It's really interesting. This is how Chen Tao feels now. If it were the previous Chen Tao, he would have been scared if he was pointed at by a gun. But today, looking at this yellow-haired man pointing a gun at him, he felt interesting, that's all. The yellow-haired man's smile slightly withered, and his eyebrows slightly wrinkled. It was strange, and the yellow-haired man was full of doubts. In the past, when he pointed the muzzle of the gun at others, others were scared and trembling, but the man and the woman in front of him had no fear or uneasiness on their faces. The yellow-haired man twitched his lips and said, "Aren't you afraid?" Chen Tao crossed his arms, looked at the yellow-haired man, and said with a smile, "Why should I be afraid?" The yellow-haired man narrowed his eyes, "Aren't you afraid of death?" Chen Tao looked at the yellow-haired man and said, "Of course I'm afraid of death. Who in this world is not afraid of death?" The yellow-haired man frowned suddenly, stared at Chen Tao, and said, "You dare to smile at me when you are facing a gun?" The yellow-haired man said, "You think I don't dare to shoot, right?" He figured it out. This guy is not afraid, obviously he thinks he doesn't dare to shoot. Realizing this, the yellow-haired man narrowed his eyes, raised his hand, pointed the gun at Chen Tao's head, and said, "If you think I don't dare to shoot, then I'll shoot for you to see." As soon as the voice fell, the yellow-haired man pulled the trigger, and a bullet flew out of the silencer and shot at Chen Tao's forehead. Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly. Suddenly, the bullet stopped less than 1 meter away from Chen Tao's body. The yellow-haired man didn't see the blood spraying as he imagined. He was stunned for a moment, and when he looked closely, he found the bullets floating in the air in front of Chen Tao. The yellow-haired man's face changed. He adjusted his mentality, plucked up his courage, and continued to shoot. Bang, 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 bullets flew out of the muzzle one after another and shot at Chen Tao. Chen Tao crossed his arms and stood still. The bullets flew to a place close to Chen Tao and stopped directly. The yellow-haired man's face turned pale and he pulled the trigger suddenly. Click, the gun chamber was stuck. The bullets in the pistol were all fired. The yellow-haired man's face changed drastically, and he subconsciously took 3 steps back. He fell to the ground with his buttocks. He looked at Chen Tao and said, "Who are you?" Chen Tao looked at the yellow-haired man, he smiled faintly and said, "What am I? You will know in a while." Chen Tao raised his hand and held the bullets directly in his palm. He looked at the yellow-haired man and said faintly, "I'll give you the bullets." He waved his hand. The bullet shot at the yellow-haired man at a very fast speed, and the yellow-haired man's pupils condensed slightly. Puff, puff. The bullet sank into the yellow-haired man's leg, and instantly there were several blood holes on the yellow-haired man's leg. The yellow-haired man's pupils shrank slightly. Ah! A shrill scream sounded in the woods. "My legs!" The yellow-haired man hugged his legs and looked at the bloody holes on his legs. He couldn't help but screaming loudly in pain. Chen Tao stared at the yellow-haired man, he squatted down and looked at him. The yellow-haired man looked at Chen Tao's face, his pupils trembled, his face turned pale, and said, I was wrong, he subconsciously stepped back, his face turned pale. "I will die, I will die." The yellow-haired man's face was as pale as paper. The yellow-haired man has realized that the man in front of him is not an ordinary person, this man will kill him. "Forgive me, please forgive me." The yellow-haired man's pupils trembled slightly. Chen Tao looked at the yellow-haired man and said, "What? Don't you want to play games anymore? The yellow-haired man's face was as pale as paper. He shook his head and said, "No, no." One of his legs was broken now, how could he dare to play? Hearing this, Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly, and he smiled and said, "If you don't want to play, I'll play with you." The yellow-haired man's pupils trembled and said, "No. No." Time stopped passing. Everything around turned into blue code. The yellow-haired man's body also turned into blue code. Fang Shueqing, who was next to him, looked over here and approached Chen Tao in confusion. "Tao, what are you going to do?" She was a little curious. Hearing this, Chen Tao looked at Fang Shueqing. Chen Tao said, "Doesn't he like women?" Chen Tao smiled and said, "Then, let him become a woman." Fang Shueqing blinked, with a hint of confusion on her face. Chen Tao modified the code on the yellow-haired man. The yellow-haired man's body changed from a man at the beginning to a woman. And it was a charming woman. Time returned to normal. Yellow-haired man, no, it should be called yellow-haired woman. The yellow-haired woman opened her eyes and looked at her body. Her face changed. "You, what did you do to me? My voice, my body, what's wrong?" The yellow-haired woman looked at her body and covered her face with her hands in panic. Her pupils trembled as she looked at Chen Tao. "You, what did you do to me, what did you do?" Her voice was trembling slightly. Everything in front of her was completely out of her cognition. She actually changed from a man to a woman. Chen Tao smiled. "Don't you like women? Don't you like playing games with women? Now I will give you a chance to have fun." The words fell. The yellow-haired girl was slightly startled. She was stunned for a moment and found that the surrounding environment had changed. She struggled to get up and looked around. This is a forest. But this forest is completely different from the forest just now. The trees just now were only a few decades old, but this forest is all as tall as clouds, and visually there are at least 100-year-old giant trees. Suddenly appearing in this strange place, the yellow-haired girl panicked. She had never seen such a scene before. Roar! Suddenly, a beast roar sounded. Hearing the beast's roar, the yellow-haired girl turned pale as a sheet. "What's the sound?" "That's a creature from this civilization called the blue ape." Hearing the sound, the yellow-haired girl looked at Chen Tao. Chen Tao crossed his arms and looked at the yellow-haired girl, and said with a smile, "This blue ape is very special. People in this world, especially women, are afraid of it. When it sees women, it will kidnap women and use their bodies to make food for them. They reproduce, but most of the women die along the way." He said, "Since you like insulting women so much, then feel the feeling of being insulted now." The yellow-haired girl's face was as pale as paper. "No." Chen Tao raised his hand and waved, "Bye." His figure disappeared from the spot. The yellow-haired girl turned pale and rushed over. Don't leave me here, save me." Boom. Before the yellow-haired girl could react, a muffled sound sounded behind the yellow-haired girl. The yellow-haired girl was shocked. Her face was as pale as paper and her expression was very ugly. Roar. A low roar sounded behind the yellow-haired girl. She turned pale and looked back, and found behind her two huge giant apes with a height of 3 meters. They were dressed in rough clothes and stared fixedly at the yellow-haired girl. They stepped closer. The yellow-haired girl's face was as pale as paper and she subconsciously retreated. "No." Frightened and shrill screams rang out, lingering throughout the woods. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 422. Chen Tao returned to the woods. "Tao," a voice came. Hearing this voice, Chen Tao looked at Fang Shueqing beside him. Fang Shueqing looked at Chen Tao and said, "Where have you been?" Upon hearing this, Chen Tao said, "I took her to a very interesting place. I believe she will be happy." While speaking, Chen Tao looked at Fang Xueqing in front of him. Fang Xueqing has a really good figure. She is wearing a white shirt and has a full waist. The whole person is tall and attractive. Under the skirt, there is a pair of slender legs wrapped in white stockings, with a pair of black high-heeled round boots under her feet. With her long snow-white hair, fluffy fox ears, and long tail, she looks absolutely stunning. Her face is exquisite and complete, with a pair of big eyes under the long and narrow eyelashes, and a small cherry mouth with small, thin lips below the high bridge of the nose. Chen Tao approached Fang Xueqing, gently put his hand around Fang Xueqing's waist, and gently held her in his arms. Eyes facing each other. Chen Tao kissed Xueqing's thin lips below. Fang Xueqing's face turned red. Chen Tao's eyes fell on Fang Xueqing's figure. She was tall and proud, her skin was like gelatin, and she was naturally charming. She is extremely beautiful. Chen Tao raised his hand and hugged Fang Xueqing into his arms. Fang Xueqing was stunned for a moment. She looked at Chen Tao with two blushes on her face. There was an extra bed in the woods, and Chen Tao laid Fang Xueqing flat on the bed. He looked at Fang Xueqing's face and looked at each other. Fang Xueqing's eyes were filled with confusion. Tao. A simple sentence, but full of charm. It sounds very comfortable. Chen Tao gently approached Fang Xueqing's face, pinched her chin with his hand, raised her face, and kissed her. There is Qingyun Mountain in Qingyun Park, and now Chen Tao and Fang Xueqing are in the woods on the top of Qingyun Mountain. But now it was night, the sky was dark, and the woods were pitch black. At this time, almost no one will come. What's more, it was pitch dark and no one could see. At the same time, in a room, on the sofa, a woman was wearing a thin shirt, sitting on the sofa, crossing her legs and holding a glass of bright red wine. This woman has an excellent figure. She has a waist, a shirt that is held up high, and her legs are slender and straight, about 1 meter long by visual inspection. She has a beautiful face and long golden hair. This woman has a breathtaking beauty. Just sitting there, you can feel a noble and dignified elegance. This woman is none other than Kadi, the former Dragon King. Katie looked at the picture in front of her. Through the picture, she saw that it was Chen Tao. Look at Chen Tao and Fang Xueqing in the screen. Katie's rarely changed face had a blush. "Sister Katie, what are you looking at?" a voice sounded. Hearing this voice, Katie's heart skipped a beat, and she waved her hand as if she were a thief. The screen disappears. She calmed down and turned to look at the source of the sound. I saw Long Renlin walking over wearing the same clothes as Katie, wearing a thin shirt. Looking at Long Renlin, Katie said calmly, "I didn't see anything." "Are you dressed like this when you are with Chen Tao?" Saying that, Katie looked at Ryu Renlin. No one could possibly control what Long Renlin was wearing. When Long Renlin heard this, her face turned red. She said, "Well, he helped me before, but this is what I promised him." Katie said, "That's no wonder. With your figure and you always dress like this in front of him, no wonder you have children." Long Renlin's face turned redder. She sat down on the sofa, looked at Katie, and said, "Sister Katie, do you dress like this too?" Katie was startled. She looked at what she was wearing. She frowned and said, "I'm not doing it for him." She withdrew her gaze, looked forward, and said, "I'm just used to dressing like this at home." Hearing this, Long Renlin smiled and said, "Well, I'm a little used to it. The shirt from Dixing is quite comfortable to wear." Katie looked at Long Renlin and said, "That's true, but as your belly gets bigger, this will probably become more and more inappropriate." She crossed her arms across her chest, looked at Long Renlin, and said, "During this period, you should stay here with me. The child in your belly may be the hope of our dragon city." Hearing this, Long Renlin put her hand on her still flat belly, and her beautiful face gained a touch of motherly glory. Looking at Long Renlin's expression, there was a hint of envy in Katie's big eyes. She looked away and didn't think much about it. At the same time, in the woods, Chen Tao stood by the bed, put on his clothes, and looked at Fang Shueqing lying on the bed. Fang Shueqing's starry eyes opened slightly, lying on her side on the bed, her eyes half closed, lazy and tired. She looked at Chen Tao. Seeing Chen Tao, Fang Shueqing's eyes were twinkling with stars. Chen Tao smiled, walked to Fang Shueqing, stretched out his hand, and hugged Fang Shueqing into his arms. The bed written by Chen Tao in code was directly deleted by Chen Tao. Chen Tao and Fang Shueqing disappeared from the spot. The two were seen again in a bedroom. This bedroom is Fang Shueqing's bedroom. As soon as he entered the bedroom, Chen Tao could smell a faint fragrance, which was the fragrance of a girl. The lights come on in the bedroom. Chen Tao put the charming girl in his arms on the bed. Fang Shueqing's tail was swaying, and she lay weakly on the bed, her big eyes half closed. Chen Tao leaned down and kissed Fang Shueqing's cheek. Fang Shueqing was weak and looked at Chen Tao with half-closed eyes. Chen Tao got up and turned to leave. Suddenly, Chen Tao felt his clothes tighten. He was slightly startled, stopped, and looked behind him. Fang Shueqing was holding the corner of Chen Tao's clothes with her small hands. She looked at Chen Tao with her weak big eyes, with a glimmer in her eyes. Her expression looked very lovely. Chen Tao smiled, held her small hand in his hand, and slowly sat on the edge of the bed. Her small hands were very small and soft, as if they had no bones. Chen Tao gently held her little hand, and with his other hand, he gently stroked her somewhat messy hair, and said with a smile, "What's wrong?" When Fang Shueqing heard this, she looked at Chen Tao with a trace of desire in her big eyes, and said, "Accompany me." Her weak voice was full of charm that made people's bones soften. It was just a little powerless. But this sense of powerlessness actually added a bit of charm to her. Chen Tao looked at her, he smiled, slowly got up, pulled up the quilt, entered the quilt, and then gently hugged her. Feeling Chen Tao's actions, her eyes were filled with joy, and she slowly moved closer to Chen Tao's arms. Let Chen Tao hold her and stroke her hair. Feeling Chen Tao's warm embrace, she could feel full of security and satisfaction. She closed her eyes. Not long after, she fell asleep. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 423. The next morning, a ray of sunlight fell from the window and landed on the ground. On the big bed, Chen Tao frowned when he felt the light, and he slowly opened his eyes. As soon as he opened his eyes, Chen Tao saw the window in front of him. There was light on the window, and the light fell into the bedroom. Chen Tao closed his eyes and recalled what happened last night. Thinking of his entanglement with Fang Shueqing, the corners of his mouth rose slightly. He opened his eyes and looked around. The bed beside him was empty. Where is she? Chen Tao sat up and looked around, but did not see the perfect figure. Chen Tao retracted his sight and got out of bed. Voila la! Suddenly, Chen Tao, who was about to find Fang Shueqing's location, heard the sound of water. The sound came from the bathroom. Chen Tao subconsciously walked towards the bathroom. The bathroom door was open. Chen Tao walked to the bathroom door and looked inside. The scene in front of him made Chen Tao's eyes light up slightly. Over there, Fang Shueqing took a towel, put it in front of the sink, turned on the faucet, and used the towel to catch the water from the faucet. She was wrapped in a thin shirt. The shirt fit her body, her waist was so thin, and her figure was so tall. Her skin was as white as cream, and there was no pore on her skin, which was extremely delicate. The legs below were slender and straight. From Chen Tao's angle, he could see her perfect S-shaped figure. Her figure was really good, the furry white ears stood up high, and the tail behind her was furry and looked very beautiful. Fang Shueqing was so charming. At the same time, Fang Shueqing used a towel to catch water, then wrung it dry and wiped her face. In fact, as a spirit, Fang Shueqing has a special genetic function, her body will not have any flaws, and the dust from the outside world can't touch her. But getting up and washing every day has been a habit that has been integrated into her bones. Fang Shueqing looked at herself in the mirror, at the naturally charming face in the mirror. Fang Shueqing looked at herself, she was a little dazed. She used to be alone, from childhood to adulthood. When she was in her galaxy, she thought about suicide countless times, and felt countless times that she should not live in this world. Even the dragon man with wings from the sky, who called himself the god of the universe, wanted to kill her when he saw her. She was in great pain and helpless. Until she met that man. He completely possessed her, both her body and her soul. He let her know the meaning of her existence. The meaning of her existence was for him, just to wait for him. Thinking of Chen Tao, Fang Shueqing's face was covered with a smile. Suddenly, her waist tightened slightly. Fang Shueqing's heart skipped a beat, and someone came up behind her. Fang Shueqing entered a strong and warm embrace. Fang Shueqing's body stiffened slightly, she looked forward, and through the mirror she saw the man standing behind her. As soon as she saw the familiar face, Fang Shueqing's body slowly relaxed, and there was a hint of joy in her eyes. She said, "Tao." Chen Tao put his arms around Fang Shueqing's small waist, leaned close to her face, kissed her cheek, and said with a smile, "You are really born with a charming bone, seductive." Little fairy, at such a close distance, Chen Tao could smell the fragrance emanating from Fang Shueqing, which was very fragrant. Fang Shueqing's face was like a rosy cloud, and she said, "Husband." Early in the morning she turned sideways and fell into Chen Tao's arms. Chen Tao looked at Fang Shueqing. Although she said so, the corners of her mouth were slightly raised, revealing joy and happiness. Fang Shueqing was different from other girls. Betty was very resistant to being intimate with Chen Tao. She was the kind of arrogant type, with a scornful mouth and a straight body, while Ziqing was the kind of dependent type. And Fang Shueqing was the kind of well-behaved type. Although she was not as dependent as Ziqing, she was almost the same. Whenever Chen Tao wanted to do something, she would just refuse slightly because she felt it was not good, but she would not be too strong, and she felt a little reluctant. This felt very good. Chen Tao looked at this beautiful girl, and then gently held her tail. Fang Shueqing felt soft all over when her tail was held. "Tao." Chen Tao smiled, picked up Fang Shueqing, and walked out of the bathroom. He said gently, "In the morning, do some exercise." Fang Shueqing blushed and snuggled in Chen Tao's arms, not daring to look up. It would only take a few minutes to wash up in the morning. But Chen Tao took more than an hour to take off her clothes, and the two of them finished washing up. The two arrived at the restaurant. Fang Shueqing sat obediently at the dining table, and she looked at the man in front of her. The man looked at her, and he smiled and said, "If you want to eat something, just let number one give the order." Yeah, Fang Shueqing looked at number one and said, "Give me a lion head and a lotus seed soup." Number one nodded slightly. Chen Tao smiled and said, "For me, let's do it the same as before." Number one said, "Okay." Number one walked away. Fang Shueqing looked at Chen Tao and found that he was looking at her. Her face flushed and she looked away, not daring to look at Chen Tao for too long. Fang Shueqing's heartbeat slightly accelerated. For Fang Shueqing, this man was everything to her. He had completely occupied her, both her body and her heart. Chen Tao looked at Fang Shueqing in front of him and admired her figure. Chen Tao changed Fang Shueqing's clothes today. It was a tight black leather jacket. This was the inspiration Chen Tao saw in the Holy Land. This leather jacket fits Fang Xueqing's almost perfect figure. The tight leather jacket looks amazing on Xueqing. Fang Xueqing's figure is so perfect, and this tight leather jacket perfectly outlines her figure. This outfit. Sexy outfit. Suddenly, a voice came. Chen Tao was startled when he heard it and looked at the source of the voice. At a glance, Wu Yao came in from outside. Her big eyes looked at Fang Xueqing's clothes. Her eyes were slightly bright, and she smiled and said, "Lewd tights, no, this dress seems to be fine, what's going on?" Wu Yao looked at Fang Xueqing, who was confused, and she smiled and said, "Should I say it's the color of the clothes, or your figure, Xueqing?" Wu Yao was right. This tight leather jacket is not really lustful, but when Fang Xueqing, who has an amazing figure, wears it, the feeling is completely different. Now Fang Xueqing will probably be stared at by countless people when she walks out. Although she is wearing clothes, this tights matches her figure, and the charm is simply terrifying. Should I say it's the color of the tights? Or Fang Xueqing's color? Perhaps it is because of Fang Xueqing's charm that this situation occurs. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 424. Fang Xueqing was wearing a black leather tights. The close-fitting fabric fit her tall and voluptuous figure perfectly. It looks so beautiful. The waist is full and the waist is held up high, the fabric is held up high, the legs are slender and straight, and the hair is about 1 meter long. Under the feet are a pair of cylindrical high-heeled boots. Her proud figure is matched with her perfect figure, coupled with her natural charm. Just sitting there, people can't take their eyes away from her. It couldn't be more beautiful. Wu Yao came over and sat next to Fang Xueqing, looking straight at Fang Xueqing's clothes with her big eyes. Fang Xueqing's face turned red when Wu Yao saw her, and her fluffy snow fox ears slowly drooped. Wu Yao smiled and said, "It's so beautiful." Fang Xueqing blushed and said, "My husband wanted me to wear this, so I wore it." When Wu Yao heard this, she looked at Chen Tao. Eyes facing each other. Wu Yao smiled and said playfully, "Big pervert." Chen Tao blinked, smiled, and said, "This doesn't count, it's just a tights." While speaking, Chen Tao looked at Wu Yao in front of him. In the past, Wu Yao often wore professional attire, but now Wu Yao's clothes in this home are not so formal. She was wearing a white shirt and leather pants with a mini skirt. Her long legs were wrapped in black lace stockings, and she was wearing a pair of black high heels. Wu Yao is different from Fang Xueqing in that she does not have the natural charm. But Wu Yao's figure is not weaker than Fang Xueqing's. Her hair was tied into a neat single ponytail and draped naturally over her shoulders, revealing her beautiful face. Wu Yao's whole body was filled with the unique charm of a mature woman. In fact, Wu Yao's charm is not small, but Wu Yao is more interested in high-tech things now, so Chen Tao will only accompany Wu Yao occasionally. Wu Yao said, "Let Xueqing wear such clothes, she is still a pervert, she is a big pervert." Chen Tao smiled and said, "Okay, this big pervert can't win the title." He looked at Wu Yao and stood up. Wu Yao was slightly startled and looked at Chen Tao. Chen Tao came close to Wu Yao, put his arm around her shoulders, got close to her face, smelled the fragrance of her body, and then whispered softly in her ear, saying, "Since I am a pervert, how can I be like you? I have a beautiful woman by my side, should I do something?" Wu Yao was slightly startled. She rolled her eyes at Chen Tao and said, "Don't think about bad things. I will continue to study a high-tech thing in the afternoon." High-tech, Chen Tao gently hugged Wu Yao, smelled her fragrance, and said softly, "What high-tech things are you working on now?" Wu Yao blushed and said, "Did you know? In addition to our universe, there are other universes. Some people call other universes parallel universes." Chen Tao blinked. Chen Tao has never heard of this concept of parallel universe. Now hearing her words, Chen Tao felt a little strange. Chen Tao couldn't help but blinked and said, "Parallel world, what is a parallel world?" "Well," Wu Yao said, "that is, in our world, apart from our universe, there will be a universe exactly like ours in other places. There are people like us in it, experiencing the same things as us. We have similar things." Wu Yao looked at Chen Tao and said with a smile, "Then, what I want to make is a machine that can travel through parallel worlds at will. Doesn't it look cool?" Chen Tao blinked and looked at Wu Yao, "A machine that can travel to a parallel world." Wu Yao hummed, and she looked at Chen Tao, her eyes filled with joy. Chen Tao looked at Wu Yao's big and moving eyes. He approached Wu Yao and kissed Wu Yao's thin lips. Parted lips. Chen Tao looked at Wu Yao. Wu Yao's eyelashes trembled slightly. She slowly opened her eyes and looked at Chen Tao with her big and moving eyes. Chen Tao smiled softly and said, "It's better not to build that machine." Wu Yao was stunned, and she frowned. "Why?" Wu Yao suddenly became unhappy and frowned. "I have been researching for more than 3 months," Wu Yao said. "I am not allowed to continue researching at this time." "Why?" How could Wu Yao be allowed to continue researching? The time machine thing gave Chen Tao such a headache before, and now there's the parallel universe thing. Chen Tao looked at Wu Yao and said, "Think about it, if you use this machine to go to a parallel world, that means you and me in other parallel worlds can also come to our world. In this case, it will be troublesome to deal with." Chen Tao looked at Wu Yao's big and moving eyes. Eyes facing each other. Chen Tao said, "Someone may even die because of this incident." Wu Yao was stunned for a moment and said, "Is it so serious?" Chen Tao smiled and said, "The consequences of the machine you want to develop may be more serious than you imagine." Wu Yao's eyes were filled with luster. She pursed her thin lips and said, then I will listen to you." But there was a trace of disappointment on Wu Yao's mature little face. Wu Yao is in a very confused mood now. She is full of interest in high-tech things. Ever since she was with Chen Tao, she has been studying and learning knowledge from various civilizations, and even civilizations from other worlds. During this time, with the help of Chen Tao, she possessed the 5th-generation gene body. Through the genetic abilities brought to her by the gene body, she also had the ability to write the code of this world. After possessing this ability, she also programmed a lot of high-tech things. But as her abilities improved, she gradually lost interest in the high-tech items she could program with code. It wasn't until recently that she heard the concept of parallel universes by chance, and she had the idea of building a machine that could travel through parallel worlds. She had been working quietly for half a year, but she didn't expect that Chen Tao would not let her continue her research. Looking at Wu Yao's expression. Chen Tao is not stupid, so he naturally knows what Wu Yao is thinking. Looking at Wu Yao's expression, Chen Tao gently whispered in Wu Yao's ear, "Dear." Wu Yao was still a little disappointed. When she heard the man's voice in her ear, Wu Yao closed her eyes slightly and said, "Well, what's wrong?" Chen Tao said softly, "I also need a machine now. Can you help me develop it?" The man was too close to her ear. Wu Yao couldn't help but blush on her cheeks, and said slowly, "What do you want me to help you research?" Chen Tao said in Wu Yao's ear, "I want you to develop a machine that can instantly jump the distance between universes." Wu Yao was stunned and looked at Chen Tao, "Between the universe and the universe? What does this mean?" She didn't quite understand what Chen Tao meant. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 425. Chen Tao looked at Wu Yao, slowly put his arm around her waist, then leaned close to her ear and said gently, "The universe we are in now is called a small universe. From the outside, the small universe is just a ball. In addition to our small universe, there are many small universes outside." Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly, and said, "Before, many people from other small universes would come to attack the small universe. To be honest, I also want to go to their universes, but there has always been a difficulty. Wu Yao looked at Chen Tao. What difficulty? Hearing this, Chen Tao said, well, there is a very difficult place, that is, the small universe and the small universe have a long time, but the distance is too long. If you want to go there, it will take a very long time, at least several years, and the longest, it is estimated to be 100 years. Chen Tao looked at Wu Yao and smiled, so, I need such a machine. Wu Yao's eyes were shining. She smiled and said, okay, then I will study it. So good. Chen Tao gently leaned close to Wu Yao and kissed her cheek. Wu Yao's eyes were shining. She smiled and she stood up. Chen Tao was slightly startled and looked at Wu Yao. Wu Yao looked at Chen Tao and said, then I'll go find some information first. Chen Tao blinked and said, don't you want to eat something? Upon hearing this, Wu Yao said, no, I'm going to ask someone for advice. Who? Chen Tao became interested. Wu Yao gave Chen Tao a smile and said, Kati. Chen Tao smiled, well, go ahead. Indeed, Katie was once the king of the dragon people. She knew a lot of things. Even if she didn't know, as long as she looked for her, she would always find the right person to ask. However, in Chen Tao's opinion, it was almost impossible for Wu Yao to invent a machine that could instantly cross the distance between universes. You know, there are many small universes in the big universe, and there are tens of billions of advanced intelligent life in those small universes, but no one has developed a machine that shortens the distance between universes. How could Wu Yao research it? However, Wu Yao likes to study high-tech things, so Chen Tao asked her to give up studying the machine that travels through parallel universes. If she is not allowed to find something else to play with, I guess Wu Yao will be very bored. Forget it. Chen Tao did not think much about it and sat on the chair by himself. At this time, today's breakfast was already set in front of the table. It was a steak. Chen Tao picked up the knife and fork and started eating by himself. Ah! Steak, a voice sounded. Hearing the lowly voice coming from the side, Chen Tao looked over. Betty trotted over. She got up by herself, sat in Chen Tao's arms, then raised her face, looked at Chen Tao, and said, I want it. Hearing this delicate lowly voice, Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly. He smiled and said, yeah. He picked up a piece of beef with a fork and sent it to Betty's mouth. Betty took a bite and ate it with a look of enjoyment. Seeing Betty enjoying herself, Chen Tao gently hugged her waist and said with a smile, aren't you teaching Liz how to save her life? How do you have time to come here? When Betty heard this, she frowned, looked at Chen Tao, and said, why? I came to see you, are you unhappy? Betty's face bulged slightly, and she looked a little unhappy. Looking at Betty's angry look, Chen Tao smiled, pinched Betty's chin, and raised her face. Then, while Betty hadn't reacted yet, Chen Tao leaned down and blocked her mouth. After a long time, their lips parted. Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly, and he looked at Betty. Betty's eyelashes moved, and she slowly opened her eyes, revealing her star-like eyes. Looking at Betty's expression, Chen Tao's eyebrows slightly relaxed, and he smiled and said, do you think I don't like you coming to see me? He gently hugged Betty's waist, hugged her closer, and his eyes fell on Betty. Betty has always been very courageous. Although she is in the restaurant now, she is still wearing very simple clothes, just a thin white shirt. Under the hem of the shirt, there is a pair of slender and straight legs. Her skin is as white as cream. A long fiery red hair matches that beautiful little face. She is like an exquisite doll, beautiful and moving. So beautiful. Chen Tao's heart was warmed when he saw it. Betty's face turned slightly red, and she rolled her eyes at Chen Tao and said, I am teaching Liz how to use genetic functions to control weapons, but even if I learn, I still have to eat. Betty looked in one direction and said, "Liz, you are right." "Liz." Chen Tao looked in the direction Betty was looking at. Sure enough, Liz was standing at the entrance of the restaurant. She was wearing a thin shirt like Betty, and her long black hair was tied into two ponytails, which made her look very cute. She was standing there timidly. She looked at this side with some uneasiness. Chen Tao saw Liz and their eyes met. Liz said, "Brother Chen Tao." Chen Tao smiled and said, "Are you hungry?" Liz blinked and said, "Liz doesn't feel hungry, it's just morning, and I'm used to eating something in the morning." Sister Betty said, "Come here to eat," so I followed. Her beautiful lowly voice is very nice. Hearing this, Chen Tao said, "Well, come over, try the steak, which is Betty's favorite." Chen Tao looked at number one. Number one knew what Chen Tao meant. She smiled, bowed to Chen Tao, and then retreated to prepare. Liz hummed. She looked around, she seemed a little reserved in this unfamiliar place. Seeing Liz's actions, Chen Tao smiled, he looked at Liz. Liz was dressed exactly like Betty, both wearing thin shirts, and her slender legs looked very delicate underneath. But why? Why did she dress the same as Betty? This made Chen Tao a little stunned. Betty dressed like that, in fact, because it was convenient for Chen Tao, and it was also Chen Tao who told her to dress like that. Later, because Chen Tao often asked her to dress like that, she gradually got used to it, so she was like that. But Liz is not Betty, it is very strange for her to dress like this. Liz sat obediently on the chair, she looked over here. Seeing Chen Tao staring at her, Liz's eyes were shining with a hint of light, and there was confusion on her face. Suddenly, Chen Tao felt a pain in his waist. He was startled, and when he came to his senses, he found that a small hand was pinching the flesh on his waist and twisting it into a twist. The owner of the small hand was puffing up his cheeks and staring at Chen Tao with big eyes. "Is Betty jealous?" Chen Tao smiled slightly, held her small hand, pulled it away from his waist, wrapped her small hand with his big hand, and said with a smile, "Eat steak." Betty rolled her eyes at Chen Tao, retracted her gaze, and didn't dare to look at Chen Tao, staring at the steak. Chen Tao gently cut the steak for her and put it in front of her little mouth for her to eat. After a bite, her puffed cheeks disappeared, and a happy smile appeared on her face. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 426. Seeing Betty's comfortable look, Chen Tao also smiled and said, "Baby, come and cut the steak, okay?" Betty was startled. She looked at Chen Tao with her big eyes. "I'm cutting the steak? Why?" Chen Tao looked at Betty and said with a smile, "I want to free up my hands." Betty's eyes were full of doubts. "With your hands free, what are you doing with your hands free?" Chen Tao looked into Betty's eyes and smiled mysteriously. Betty was not stupid, she realized something immediately, her face immediately turned red, she gave him a lovely eye roll, and said, "I don't want it, you big bad guy, big pervert." With his hands free, this man must be asking her to do something. Chen Tao smiled and said, "That doesn't matter." He let go of the knife and fork, put his hand on Betty's waist, and said, "If you want to eat, you can cut it yourself." Betty's face turned slightly red and she muttered, "Bad guy." She adjusted her sitting posture, sat down, picked up the knife and fork, and started cutting the steak by herself. It's just that Chen Tao's hands are free and he can do something he usually likes to do. Betty's face turned red. Chen Tao was free, looked at Liz next to him, and said, "Who tied those ponytails for you?" Liz looked at Chen Tao's smile and said, "Sister Betty tied it for me." Sister Betty said it would look better this way. It's indeed pretty. This little loli looks very cute with her delicate twin tails. But why does Betty have a preference for wearing double ponytails? He looked at Betty. Betty herself did not have a pair of ponytails, but her fiery red hair was like a waterfall, hanging down naturally and looking beautiful. It would be much cuter if it were just twin tails. Before, Betty's twin tails were tied by others for her, and she had no idea of tying her own twin tails. Betty raised her face, looked at Chen Tao, and said, "How about the twin tails I tied up, do they look good?" She showed a playful smile and looked at Chen Tao. Chen Tao smiled and said, "Of course she looks good, she looks very cute." He looked at Liz. Upon hearing this, Betty was slightly startled. Frankly speaking, the reason why Betty tied Liz's twin tails was just because she was interested in it. But now looking at Chen Tao staring directly at Liz, Betty couldn't help but think of something in her mind. Before, when White Dragon King Bai Yao tied her into twin ponytails, he told her that Chen Tao liked twin ponytails. But now, when she saw Chen Tao looking directly at Liz, Betty suddenly became furious. She puffed up her cheeks, raised her hand, held Chen Tao's leg, and squeezed it hard. Chen Tao only felt pain in his legs. He recovered from the pain and quickly reached out to hold Betty's little hand that was executing Chen Tao's punishment. Chen Tao smiled bitterly and said, "What are you doing? It hurts." Hearing this, Betty gave Chen Tao a roll of her eyes and said, "Lolakan, you big pervert, you deserve it." Chen Tao blinked. He realized something, a smile appeared on his face and said, "Are you jealous?" Betty was cutting the steak by herself and ignored Chen Tao. She just puffed up her cheeks and said, "Who would be jealous of you? That's nonsense." Chen Tao smiled and said, "Okay." He hugged Betty, moved his face close to hers, and kissed her cheek. The man behind her held her petite figure in his arms, feeling the warmth of the embrace and his own smallness. Betty's heart seemed to be filled with something. It was a feeling of being held in someone's arms, a feeling of being protected and loved, and very reassuring. Chen Tao gently said in Betty's ear, "I love you." These three simple words made Betty's heart skip a beat, and her eyes gained a trace of blurred moisture. She lightly pursed her thin lips and said, "I don't care about you anymore, let's eat." She really didn't care about Chen Tao. But looking at Betty's little cheeks that were no longer bulging, Chen Tao smiled. At this time, Chen Tao noticed that number one had brought another steak and placed it in front of Liz. Liz looked at the unfamiliar food in front of her, and then looked at Chen Tao. Just met Chen Tao's gaze. Chen Tao looked at number one and said, "Come and help Liz cut the steak. Once it's chopped, teach Liz how to eat it." "Okay, Master." Number one responded respectfully with a smile on his face. Number one took the knife and fork, cut the steak skillfully, then handed the knife and fork to Liz, smiled gently and said, "You can use the fork to put the cut pieces of meat into your mouth, and you can eat it. Please try it, Miss Liz." Liz hummed, "Thank you." Number one still had that signature smile on his face. Liz took a piece of it with a fork and put it into her mouth. After taking a bite, Liz's eyes lit up slightly. Looking at Liz's expression, Betty smiled and said, "Is it delicious?" Liz hummed and said, "It tastes good, it smells so good, it tastes so amazing. I don't even know food can have such a problem." "That's right," Betty said with a smile, "in your world, you eat barbecued food every day without any seasoning. It's definitely not as delicious as this." Liz ate quickly. After a while, Liz blinked and said, "It's delicious, but it's just too little." Betty's eyes lit up slightly. Looking at Liz, Betty smiled and said, "I feel the same way." Betty looked at Chen Tao and said with a smile, "Look, I said it before, this is too little." Chen Tao couldn't help but smile bitterly, looked at number one and said, "Go and make 6 more, let them eat enough. How can this be too little? This is basically a steak for one person, which is enough. However, it is of course different for these two people. In that world, Liz eats barbecue, and she eats it in whole pieces. The portion of a piece is of course much larger than the portion of the steak. In addition, because it tastes good, Liz will of course want to eat more, so naturally she thinks it is too little. Not to mention Betty, she is a dragon person, and the ancestors of dragon people are dinosaurs. If she wants to eat, a steak for one person is naturally not enough. Since these two little lolies like to eat, let them eat enough, this time. Chen Tao looked at Liz and said with a smile, I'll let you guys have enough this time. Oh, I forgot to ask, how are you doing with Betty? Liz blinked and looked at Chen Tao. She said, Sister Betty, let me control a knife and spin it around in the air. I have already mastered the basics. Chen Tao nodded slightly. Spinning around in the air, that means remote control of objects, interesting. Liz learned to use genetic functions to remotely control attack weapons, which was naturally much more powerful in her original cold weapon era. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 427. Chen Tao smiled and said, Then show me, let me see what you learned yesterday. Liz hummed, raised her hand and raised her index finger. Suddenly, a dagger appeared in front of Liz. At the moment when the dagger appeared, Chen Tao could feel the fluctuation of the space wormhole. Obviously, Liz moved the dagger through the computational space wormhole. However, Liz's speed surprised Chen Tao. She was so skilled in controlling the dagger, which means that she has a strong talent. Looking at the dagger suspended in the air, Chen Tao smiled and said, Liz. Liz looked at Chen Tao. Chen Tao smiled and said, You're. He raised his hand, and a dark ball appeared out of thin air in his hand. It is said to appear out of thin air, but in fact it is also a substance generated out of thin air through his genetic function. Chen Tao looked at Liz and smiled and said, Can you control the dagger and cut off this ball? Liz said softly. She pointed at the black ball in Chen Tao's hand. The dagger flashed by. The black ball in Chen Tao's hand was still the same as before, intact. Chen Tao looked at the black ball and put it on the table. The black ball fell down and split into two halves. Chen Tao looked at Liz. Liz's expression did not change at all, as if she had done something very ordinary. In other words, it was probably yesterday that Betty asked Liz to do such a thing. So, she acted so casually. Chen Tao looked at the black ball. Liz has now been upgraded to a second-generation gene warrior by Betty, and also has the ability to remotely control dark silver weapons. With the power that Liz has now, if Liz goes back to her previous civilization, I believe she will be able to dominate that civilization. However, Chen Tao looked at the petite little loli in front of him. Can she let this loli kill someone? Can she do it? Chen Tao's eyes fell on Betty in his arms, and his hand gently stroked her hair, and asked gently, Betty, when do you plan to let her go back? He didn't say anything, but communicated with Betty directly in the gene channel. In this way, Liz couldn't hear it either. When Betty heard it, she took a knife and fork and cut a piece of beef. Chen Tao could hear the voice from his mind. Today, I plan to take her back today. That was Betty's voice. Hearing this, Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly and said, Well. Looking at the delicate little girl in his arms, Chen Tao moved closer to rub her face and kissed her on the face. Betty's face flushed and said, Don't make trouble, don't disturb me eating. Liz on the side looked at the actions of the two people in front of her, and even she couldn't help but blush. Betty looked very young, but after getting to know her for a while, Liz also knew that although Betty looked young, she knew a lot more than her, and Betty was very powerful. But even knowing this, looking at this girl who is about the same age as herself, in the man's arms, letting the man be intimate with her. For Liz, it is still a little difficult to accept, and she feels blushing all of a sudden. After a meal. Chen Tao is already a little impatient, he hugs Betty tightly. Betty's face is red, and she said, "What are you doing?" "I'm done, I still have things to do." Chen Tao smiled gently in her ear and said, "Put aside everything and stay with me for the afternoon." Betty turned her face and gave Chen Tao a cute roll of the eyes, saying, "Don't even think about it, I have to send Liz back today." "Go back," a voice sounded. Chen Tao and Betty looked at the source of the voice, only to see Liz looking here. Liz looked at Betty and said, "Can I go back?" Liz's eyes were full of expectation. Betty hummed, "Yesterday I taught you how to deal with bad guys. Now you have the ability to protect yourself and others, so of course you can go back." Liz's eyes lit up, and she smiled, "Then let's go back quickly." She stood up, looking at Liz's impatient look. Yeah, Betty also stood up. The two looked like they were about to leave together. Chen Tao said, "Wait a minute." Betty and Liz looked at Chen Tao together. Liz looked at Chen Tao, and her eyes were filled with worry. "Brother Chen Tao, you won't stop me, right?" Chen Tao smiled, "Of course I won't stop you, I just want to remind you too, if you go back in this outfit, I'm worried that those men will become horse thieves one by one." Liz was startled, she looked down, and when she looked, Liz's face flew with two blushes. She hurriedly said, "I'll go change my clothes." As she said that, she trotted away. Betty looked at Chen Tao. Chen Tao smiled and said, "Yes, at least put on the pants. I don't want my baby to be taken advantage of by others." Betty blushed and gave Chen Tao a white look, "Pervert." She walked away with small steps. Betty's current outfit is not a big problem, because the shirt is long and she is petite, so the shirt is equivalent to a skirt. But no matter how you look at it, it's still not good. Chen Tao is possessive, and he doesn't want his woman to be taken advantage of by others. After changing clothes, Betty took Liz back to the village where Liz was. Seeing the familiar village in front of her, Liz's eyes lit up slightly, and she hurried into the village and ran towards home. Betty looked at Liz's back, she crossed her arms and followed into the village unhurriedly. After entering the village, Betty looked at the situation in the village. A day passed, and all the bodies that were originally lying in the village disappeared. The traces of blood still existed, but they were obviously washed. Betty retracted her sight and looked forward. Liz had already arrived at the door of her house. Betty could just see the scene of Liz being hugged tightly by Michelle, who came out of the house. Michelle knelt on the ground and hugged Liz tightly. Liz's face was full of joy. Michelle had tears in her eyes and a look of surprise on her face. Liz said, "Mom, where's Dad?" Michelle let go of Liz, she wiped the tears from her face and said, "Your dad is out hunting, it's about time, he will be back soon." "But, Liz, where were you yesterday? Why are you back now?" When Liz heard this, she said, "Sister Betty saved me, took me to where they lived, and then she taught me some ways to deal with bad guys." "Betty, are you talking about that God?" Michelle's eyes lit up slightly, and she said, "Thank God, God saved our family." Liz's eyes were shining, and she said, "Mom, Sister Betty came back with me." "Come back together? Then where is she?" Michelle looked at Liz. Liz said, "Over there." She looked in Betty's direction. Betty was walking over leisurely. When Michelle saw Betty, she quickly knelt down in front of Betty, and then said to Liz, "Hurry, kneel down, she is God, it was God who saved our family, it was she who resurrected me and your dad." My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 428. Liz was stunned. In Liz's view, Betty was her friend, but now that she heard her mother say this, she was a little confused. But Grandma's words must be followed. Liz knelt down towards Betty. She looked at Betty. Michelle kowtowed to Betty, lowered her head, and said, "Thank God for giving me and Rightat a new life, and for saving Liz. Looking at Michelle's expression, Betty said, "I didn't save you just to see you kneel down for me. Get up." When Michelle heard this, she looked at Betty. "Yes," Michelle responded and got up with Liz. Michelle looked at Betty and said, "Michelle is just a little woman, and Liz is still young too. But we will always remember God's kindness to us and will never forget it." Hearing this, Betty said calmly, "Don't say such things to me. The purpose of saving you is not to let you remember my kindness. I just felt that I couldn't bear it, so I took action. This is what I want to do. As for what you think, it has nothing to do with me." Michelle was startled, and she looked at Betty blankly. Betty's eyes fell on Liz, and she said, "Well, Liz, now you are back. You also know how to protect people, so it's time for me to go back." Betty showed a faint smile, looked at Liz and said, "See you next time." A miniature wormhole appeared next to it. Looking at the dark wormhole, Liz was slightly startled and said, "Sister Betty, are you leaving so soon?" This was something Liz didn't expect. She was eager to see her parents, but she didn't expect to hear the news that Betty was leaving when she saw her mother. Betty was very kind to Liz, and she also saved Liz's life. Liz still had a sense of dependence on Betty. Now that she heard that Betty was leaving, Liz suddenly realized that maybe Betty's departure would forever affect her. Liz felt uncomfortable all over without seeing Betty. There was a trace of tears in her eyes, and she pursed her thin lips. Looking at Liz's expression, Betty smiled slightly and said, "No need to be so sad. If you want to see me, just say my name silently in your heart." Liz's eyes lit up slightly, and she said, "Really?" "Of course," Betty said, "let's go." Betty stepped into the miniature wormhole and disappeared from the sight of Liz and Michelle. The micro wormhole also slowly dissipated. Looking at the scene in front of her, Liz's eyes glowed with a hint of luster. "Sister Betty," Liz murmured to herself. At the same time, in Chen Tao's bedroom, Chen Tao was wearing a bathrobe, sitting on the bedside, leaning on the pillow as a back cushion, looking at the scene in front of him. In the picture, it was Betty leaving Liz. Chen Tao took a breath and looked to the side. There is a miniature wormhole next to it, and Betty's figure walks out of the wormhole. Looking at Betty, Chen Tao smiled. He turned off the screen, then put the pillow away, lay down, and patted the place next to him. Betty was startled for a moment, her little cheeks turned red, she gave Chen Tao a blank look, then she walked over and sat on the bedside, looking at Chen Tao without leaning over. Seeing Betty's expression, Chen Tao smiled and said, "Come here." He stretched out his hand and held Betty's little hand with a slight force. Betty's body was very light. With a slight pull, Betty struggled symbolically and was pulled into Chen Tao's arms. He took her in his arms and held her tenderly. Her petite body was held in Chen Tao's arms, and Chen Tao could smell her body fragrance. He said gently, "Can you just leave Liz there?" Betty pursed her thin lips and said, "Then what are you going to do? Keep her here forever, or will you let me live with her?" Betty sounded a little angry. Chen Tao was slightly startled. He looked at Betty and said with a smile, "I didn't mean anything else, and I didn't say what you did was wrong." He hugged her tightly, gently stroked her soft hair, and said softly, "No matter what, Liz is just a little girl, not even 14 years old. Isn't it a little bit to let her protect others? Is it too difficult for her?" Betty said calmly, "So what? If she doesn't protect them, the people who die will be the people around her. If she has the ability, she must do it. She is casual but also cruel." Betty said, "In Dragon City, all female dragons were innocent little girls at first, but now those female dragons don't all have to experience that. The enemy will not stop killing her just because she is young." Chen Tao's eyebrows relaxed slightly. He looked at Betty. Betty was a little depressed. She seemed to have thought of something. Looking at Betty's expression, Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly. Could it be that Betty is like this too? Yes. Also, before Betty became the Red Dragon King, she was just a little woman. Chen Tao approached Betty, kissed her forehead, and said, "I'm sorry, I wasn't by your side when you faced that cruel thing." Betty was startled, she raised her face, gave Chen Tao a lovely eye roll, and then hid her little head in Chen Tao's arms. "We dragons are different from you humans. The children of us dragons are born warriors. I have been fighting since I was a child, and I also yearn to fight," Betty said. "Don't get me wrong, I am not an ordinary person, humans are so cowardly." Hearing this, Chen Tao couldn't help but smile and said, I believe my baby is strong." He hugged Betty and said gently, "If my baby didn't beg me for mercy so often, I would believe it more." Betty blushed, bit her thin lips, raised her little hand, beat Chen Tao's chest, and said, "Bad guy." Chen Tao smiled, he held Betty's hand and kissed her. Betty's face was flushed, and her little face was hidden in Chen Tao's arms. Chen Tao looked at Betty's delicate expression, his eyes were full of tenderness, he slowly approached Betty and said gently, "Baby, come." No, Betty blushed. Seeing Betty's expression, Chen Tao's eyebrows slightly relaxed, and he smiled, "That won't do. Didn't you say that you are very brave? Why are you afraid?" Betty's eyelashes trembled slightly, and her big eyes sparkled with water. She said, "Bad guy." Chen Tao whispered in her ear, "Tell me, your body becoming smaller will affect our affairs? Is it because of your small body that you often beg for mercy from me?" The warm voice entered Betty's ears. Betty only felt her face getting hot. She beat Chen Tao's chest with her little hand very unwillingly. Big pervert, bad guy, big bad guy, what a weird question, so bad." You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 429. Chen Tao held Betty's hand, and looked at her. Betty's face was red. The cute look of this little Lolita made Chen Tao feel very interesting. Chen Tao looked at Betty, and whispered in her ear, "I think it should be related to the size of the body. How about you become bigger this time?" "Big pervert," Betty screamed, and struggled symbolically in Chen Tao's arms, saying, "If you say it again, I will ignore you." Her face was red like clouds. This man is too much. What does he mean? What does he think of her? He wants her to be smaller and bigger, and this change is to make Chen Tao happy. This man is such a bastard. Chen Tao laughed out loud. Ha ha. Betty hummed and said, "Big bad guy." She was very angry. This bad guy is too much. Really too much. He actually bullied her. Chen Tao smiled, slowly approached Betty, then kissed her cheek and said with a smile, "So, it's not." "Of course not." Betty blushed and said, "How could it be this reason?" "What is the reason?" Chen Tao asked with interest, looking at Betty's blushing and anxious expression. "It feels particularly cute." Hearing this, Betty blushed and said, "You know." Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly, and he smiled and said, "No, I don't know." "You obviously know it." Betty hid her face in Chen Tao's arms. "You bully people." Looking at Betty's blushing face, Chen Tao smiled, gently stroked her back, comforted her, and then gently coaxed, "I really don't know, dear, tell me, let me know." Betty blushed like a rosy cloud, and said softly, "No." "Be good, I want to know." Chen Tao coaxed gently, very gently, and gently. Betty's eyes were a little blurred, she closed her eyes, and her cheeks were red. Chen Tao smiled and said, "Be good." Betty shook her head. Chen Tao gently leaned close to her ear and whispered in a magnetic voice, saying, I love you. The three short words turned into a warm current and sank into her heart. Betty's heartbeat slightly accelerated, and her consciousness was confused. Let me know, okay, Chen Tao said gently, I want to know everything about you. Well. Betty pursed her lips and closed her eyes, okay. In the future, Betty, tell me that if you make your body senses more sensitive and don't use genetic abilities to block your body's feelings, you will be very happy. Betty blushed. Then, I will use genetic functions to change myself, and then, you are so bad. Chen Tao certainly knew about this, he knew it a long time ago. But when he heard Betty say this in person, Chen Tao felt very interesting. Chen Tao said gently, so, you did it for me? No. No, Betty blushed and said, I did it for myself. I think that if you are happy, I will be happy. So, I will make you happy, and then I will be happy. I did it for myself, not for you. Chen Tao smiled, really? But every time, you begged me to let you go. Isn't that not good? It's you, Betty said unwillingly, you are a big pervert. Her face was red. If this man hadn't gone too far, she might have begged for mercy. Chen Tao smiled, he slowly approached Betty and said, in fact, I knew about this a long time ago, but I just wanted to see you say it yourself, it feels very interesting. Bad guy. Betty blushed and cursed softly, but her unique lowly voice became very light. She seemed to be powerless. Betty had no choice. How could she bear being teased by Chen Tao like this? Looking at Betty with her eyes closed and her face flushed. Chen Tao smiled and said softly in Betty's ear, then, can we start? Bad, you are bad. Betty cursed Chen Tao weakly. This man is too much. Chen Tao smiled, moved closer to Betty and kissed her. Betty is so cute. She has a proud personality, but she has always been the passive party in matters between men and women. Betty has always been the one who can't resist Chen Tao's wishes. Chen Tao spent the afternoon as he wished. In the evening, the bedroom lights came on. Chen Tao looked at Betty beside him. Betty closed her eyes, lay on her side, and slept soundly. Looking at Betty's cute appearance, Chen Tao smiled, raised his hand, and gently stroked her little face. Betty, the king of red dragons, has now completely become a little woman. This feeling is particularly interesting. Betty is too tired. Chen Tao slowly sat up and walked to the bathroom. Let her rest for a while. It's just right, I can take the opportunity to go out for a walk. On the other side. Inside the sanctuary. It is already evening. After working all day, Jenna took a shower and sat on the sofa in a silky black nightgown. She crossed her legs and took a sip of red wine. Jenna looked through the French window at the brightly lit sanctuary below. The sanctuary has changed. It has changed completely. Everything has changed since that man came here, but is this change good or bad? Jenna's eyes were shining. At this time, Jenna noticed that a couple was leaning against each other on the street, talking and laughing as they walked. Seeing this, Jenna frowned slightly. Her eyebrows slightly relaxed. If it was in the past, seeing this scene, Jenna would go directly over and take people to send the two people to be burned at the stake. But now it is different. The rules of the Holy Land have been revised and announced. Now couples are legal. Jenna thought of that man in her mind. Thinking of what that man did to her. Jenna's face flushed. Emotions, Jenna slowly got up, put the wine glass aside, she got on the bed, lay on the bed, and looked at the ceiling. Thinking of that man, Jenna's eyes were shining, and she turned slightly. Will he come to me? Jenna closed her eyes and muttered to herself. As soon as she closed her eyes, all Jenna thought of was the figure of that man. When she thought of that man bullying her like a sheep, like a hungry wolf. Jenna's face was red, but she didn't hate him, but felt happy. That man was not a good person. In Jenna's opinion, he was just a criminal. But Jenna found that she couldn't help falling in love with him. "Where is he now? When will he come to see me?" Jenna whispered. "He? Who are you talking about?" A man's voice sounded in the bedroom. Hearing this voice, Jenna opened her eyes suddenly. "Who? My time is running out." Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 430. Jenna quickly stood up and looked back. A blond man wearing a black uniform was standing at the door, staring at Jenna, the corners of his mouth raised slightly. Seeing this man, Jenna's expression changed. "Leija, what do you want to do?" Leiji is one of several squad leaders in the law enforcement corps. But Jenna never expected that Leiji would sneak into her room in the middle of the night. Jenna felt uneasy and quickly got out of bed. "Don't move!" A red light spot appeared on Jenna's body. Jenna took a look and found that Leiji was holding a gun in his hand and pointed the gun at Jenna. There is a red light in front of the gun, and the red light emitted by the red light is directed at Jenna. Jenna was stunned and didn't dare to move. "Leija, what do you want to do?" she was pointed at with a gun, but Jenna's expression did not change at all. It was still the same as before, cold and cold, like an iceberg beauty. The corner of Leiji's mouth raised, and his eyes fell on Jenna. "Everyone knows that you and Dimantia, the leader of the resource group, have always been sworn enemies, and now Dimantia has become the commander. The laws of the sanctuary have been changed. It's only a matter of time before you, the former leader of the law enforcement team, will be abandoned." He squinted his eyes and looked at Jenna's figure. Jenna was wearing a thin black lace gauze skirt. Her figure was tall and proud. The belt tied her slender waist, the skirt was very short, and her legs were slender and straight. Fair skin without any blemishes. Under the blonde hair is a cold face, with big eyes and thin lips. A cool face paired with a proud figure. Leiji's Adam's apple rolled up, the corners of his mouth raised. He looked at Jenna and said, "In the past, you were highly trusted by the commander, and everyone in the law enforcement group also listened to you. I didn't dare to take action, but it's different now. You will definitely be targeted by Dimantia in the future, and then you will be killed by Dimantia. If something happens to you, play with me before it happens." Leiji stared at Jenna and said, "I heard that you have never been to the gene exchange hall. I guess you have never experienced that wonderful feeling, so let me let you experience it. How about it?" I felt Leiji's gaze as if he could see into the flesh. Jenna pulled down her clothes, looked at Leiji, and said, "You are shameless." Her cold face showed no change in expression at all. Leiji frowned suddenly. Looking at Jenna's expression, looking at Jenna's dignified, calm, and arrogant expression, Leiji felt uncomfortable all over. He raised the muzzle of his gun, pointed it at Jenna, and said, "You bitch, you dare to be so cold and arrogant and take off your skirt when I point a gun at you." Jenna didn't move. Leiji frowned and shouted sternly, "Take it off. Otherwise, I will beat you to death." He pointed the gun at Jenna's head, and the red light was aimed at Jenna's eyebrows. Jenna shook her clothes and looked at Leiji. "Take it off." Leiji's face was gloomy, his finger pressed on the trigger, looking like he was about to fire at any time. "Is there any way?" "There is no way." Jenna has no way now. She didn't have any weapons on her body. Apart from herself, she only had this black gauze skirt. Without weapons, Jenna is just an ordinary woman. When it comes to physical strength, she is no match for men. What's more, facing Leiji who is holding a weapon. But if Jenna was asked to take off her clothes, she couldn't do it. Jenna looked at Leiji and said calmly, "Kill me." Leiji frowned and said, "I can't bear to kill you." After the words fell, Leiji strode to Jenna's side, holding a gun in one hand and holding Jenna's hand with the other hand. He turned Jenna around forcefully and pushed her hand hard. Jenna fell forward, and in front of her was the bed where Jenna had just slept. His body collapsed and he fell onto the bed. Lei Ji raised his hand and pressed the muzzle of the gun against Jenna's back. Jenna felt the cold metal of the gun coming from her back, and she didn't dare to move. Lei Ji stretched out his big hand and held Jenna's clothes. Hiss. There was a sound of clothes ripping. The clothes behind Jenna were torn apart. Ha ha, Lei Ji laughed loudly and said, "You, the former head of the law enforcement group, are usually aloof and look down on others. Now let me take care of you." Jenna's face turned pale and she gritted her teeth, but facing this situation, she had no choice but to do anything. At this moment, Lei Ji suddenly felt his neck tighten. A force came from behind. Lei Ji's body flew out in response. Bang! There was a muffled sound. Lei Ji flew out, hit the wall and fell to the ground. He fell so hard that all the bones in his body were scattered. The gun rolled to the ground. Damn it, who is it? Lei Ji struggled to get up from the ground and looked at the person. At first glance, Lei Ji's face was as pale as paper, and his pupils were trembling. I saw a person standing beside the bed, and that person was a man. This man's identity is unknown to everyone in the entire sanctuary. This is God. The God who saved the Holy Land and liberated the Holy Land. And God is here now? That's right, the person who came was none other than Chen Tao. Chen Tao looked at Jenna on the bed. Jenna's clothes were in a mess. She was turning over from the bed. She covered her chest with her hands, and then looked at Chen Tao. There was no change in her face at all, but there was a hint of joy in her big, moving eyes. Seeing that Jenna was fine, Chen Tao retracted his gaze and looked at Lei Ji. Lei Ji's face was filled with fear. He quickly knelt down in front of Chen Tao and said, God, this Jenna is the head of the law enforcement group. She was a minion of the original commander before. She used those harsh and hateful laws of the Holy Land to madly punish people in the Holy Land. She is cruel and violent. She is a damned person. God, she deserves to die. Lei Ji hurriedly said, I am just doing justice for the heaven. Chen Tao looked at Lei Ji, he crossed his arms and said lightly, do you do justice for the heaven? You know Jenna is the head of the law enforcement group, and you know a lot about her, but there is an identity that you don't know yet. Lei Ji was stunned when he heard it, and said, what identity? Hearing this, Chen Tao said, Jenna, in addition to being the head of the law enforcement group, she is also my woman. Lei Ji was stunned. What? Chen Tao raised his hand, aimed at Lei Ji, and pinched it. In an instant, the air pressure changed, forming a sphere, directly covering Lei Ji in the terrifying spherical pressure. The pressure suddenly increased. No. Don't, Lei Ji screamed. Lei Ji's body exploded, and then was pressed into a ball by the pressure and dissipated into a blood mist. Seeing this, Chen Tao retracted his sight and looked at Jenna beside him. Jenna held the remaining pieces of cloth in her hand and blocked it in front of her. She sat on the bed, looked at Chen Tao, and said, why are you here? Chen Tao's eyes fell on Jenna, and looking at Jenna in front of him, Chen Tao's heartbeat slightly accelerated.